Now, here is your host, Kim Corbin.
A couple of weeks ago, I went back to my hometown of Carmel, Indiana, to attend a family wedding. One night, as is not uncommon in my family, I found myself in a spirited conversation about the state of the world with my dad, uncle, and brother. After we lamented the actions of Donald Trump and his administration for a while, I shared my personal belief that the challenges we are now facing as a nation are ultimately a wake-up call for each of us to do the inner work necessary to help elevate our collective consciousness. Now, while concepts like raising consciousness have become almost commonplace to me after working at New World Library for over 12 years now, my dad and my uncle, both of whom are heavyweights when it comes to intellectual discourse, challenged me unrelentingly to explain things like awakening and consciousness in terms they could better understand. I took a lot of deep breaths and stayed as present as possible as I did my best to give words to the inner shift I've experienced in my own life over the past 2 decades. But it wasn't until I cracked open a copy of my guest today, Steve Taylor's most recent book, which is called The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening, that I was able to paint a clear enough picture of the awakening process to help put my dad and my uncle's minds at ease. In the introduction to The Leap, Steve defines spiritually awakened individuals as those who have attained an ongoing state of inner peace and wholeness with a sense of connection or unity with the world around them, and a selfless desire to love and support their fellow human beings. And from there, he goes on to paint a comprehensive picture of what it means to be enlightened or spiritually awakened from both a psychological and historical perspective. Steve Taylor is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the United Kingdom. He is the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, and for the last 4 years, he has been included in Watkins' Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's list of the 100 most spiritually influential people. Steve came to New World Library thanks to the one and only Eckhart Tolle. Both The Leap and the first book by Steve that we published called The Calm Center are part of Eckhart Tolle Edition's imprint, which features books personally selected by Eckhart for publication. Eckhart describes Steve's work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present, and I wholeheartedly agree. I have a much clearer understanding and more trust in my own awakening journey after reading The Leap from cover to cover, and I've been really looking forward to having this opportunity to talk about the book. So thank you, Steve Taylor, so much for being here.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd like for us to begin by having you explain what you mean by spiritual awakening in the simplest terms possible.
Okay. Well, I would define spiritual awakening as an expansion and an intensification of awareness. So on the one hand, it means perceptual awareness. So when one becomes awakened, the world becomes a different place. The world becomes more real, more vivid, and more alive and more beautiful. And we become more appreciative of simple things and of everyday things. We develop a sense of wonder and a sense of beauty. But also there's a kind of an inner aspect where we develop a sense of inner peace and stillness, and we feel a sense of connection. We transcend the seeming separateness which many people experience, and we gain a sense of connection and unity to other people, to other living beings, or to the whole cosmos. But also there are some what you could call conceptual changes too, in that awakened people, they have a very all-embracing, unconditional sense of love for their fellow human beings, and they have no sense of group identity, so no sense of identity as an English person, American person, a socialist or a Democrat or whatever. They feel that all human beings are equally lovable, and they feel a strong sense of compassion and empathy for all living beings.
Beautiful. Thank you. And in the book, you use the concept of a self-system to help explain what happens in the awakening process. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in what I call the sleep state, which is human beings' most normal state, the state which most people in history have lived in and which, unfortunately, most people in the world live in today, the sleep state is one of constricted awareness. It's a state in which the world around us seems mundane and even unreal. And the sleep state stems from what I call the self system of sleep. And the self system is really, it's very similar to the term mind. The self system includes our normal mental structures and our concepts of our sense of identity, our concepts of who we are. And one of the main characteristics of the sleep state, or the self system associated with the sleep state, is a strong boundary. There's a strong boundary between the individual human being and the world out there. So there's a sense of otherness and a sense of separateness. But in wakefulness, a new self-system takes over. So it could be if you undergo gradual wakefulness, which happens when we follow spiritual practices and spiritual paths. Gradually, we reshape our self-system. For example, we soften the boundary between us and the world. And eventually the boundary becomes so soft that it may dissolve away altogether. And therefore we experience a sense of unity. Or if wakefulness occurs very suddenly, which it sometimes does, usually in response to psychological turmoil and trauma, suddenly a new self-system is born. The old self-system, with all the old psychological structures and the boundaries of the old self-system, all of that fades away, and a new self-system seems to take over.
And I really like how the ego is just one aspect of the self system, because it seems like the ego tends to get a bad rap at times, even though we'll always have one, right?
Yeah, I mean, the metaphor I use for the ego is that in the normal self system, in our sleep state, the ego is a bit like a sort of crazy Roman emperor who sort of issues all these crazy orders and dictates and lives in this gigantic palace and totally dominates the kingdom. He lives in the center of the city with all these palaces and government buildings. He's a kind of crazy dictator, like Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi, or maybe Donald Trump. But so the ego is completely out of control in the sleep state. It completely dominates our whole being. But in the awakened state, some people say that awakening means the death of the ego or the transcendence of the ego. And obviously it depends on what you mean by the term ego. But ego is really just the Latin word for I. So in the awakened state, I think there's still some sense of identity, but the ego is so kind of soft and it's so well integrated. It's more like a kind of administrator or kind of a simple organizer, like some kind of very humble government official, which only does what it needs to do and doesn't want to gain any power or doesn't want to dominate our whole being.
Yeah. So
the ego, it should really function as a kind of a simple administrator, which helps us to organize our lives, which helps us to differentiate between reality and fantasy, and so forth.
Thank you. And when I read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, for the first time 17 years ago, when I was in my early 30s, it resonated with me immediately. And if you would have asked me, based on the tools the book had given me and all of the creative magic that was happening in my life at the time, I definitely would have said back then that I had undergone a sudden awakening and that I had it all figured out and that enlightenment was mine. And it's only in hindsight, many years and a dark night of the soul later, that I've come to realize how far off I was in my assessment of my own spiritual development at the time, which is part of the reason I think that I had a lot of resistance at the beginning of the leap with the idea of self-identifying as an awakened one, because doing so feels like such a slippery egoic slope and one that I've fallen down before. So I really appreciated in the book how you wrote about your own reluctance to come out as an awakened person. And I'd love to hear about how you've personally come to terms with doing so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of my things, I'm a bit like you. I'm always a bit suspicious of spiritual teachers who say, I'm enlightened, follow me. I'm the avatar. If you follow me, you'll become enlightened too, and we can save the whole human race. So I think genuine spiritual teachers, or maybe the most enlightened spiritual teachers, they tend to be humble, and they don't broadcast themselves as enlightened. They probably agree that they're enlightened if you press them, but usually they don't tend to proclaim themselves as enlightened. So in the same way, I'm a bit reluctant to make the claim to be awakened, because it can sound a little bit arrogant, or as if I'm trying to attract followers or disciples and so forth. But one important thing to remember is that there are degrees of wakefulness. And some people it's a bit like a mountain. Wakefulness is like a mountain. Some people are at lower levels of the mountain. Some people are at the peak of the mountain. But in my own case, I think I was probably a naturally awakened person. I didn't undergo a sudden moment of transformation. I didn't attain awakening through many years of following spiritual practices. When I look back at my early life, when I was a teenager, 16 or 17 years old, I can see now that I had signs of awakening then. I was already awakened. But my issue was that I didn't understand my own being, and I thought there was just something wrong with me, because I was so different to the other people around me. The values of wakefulness were completely in contrast to the values of my culture. And so it took me several years before I understood and accepted my own wakefulness. And probably until the age of 29 or so, until I managed to fully integrate it into my being and into my life.
Wow. Well, I'm happy to say that by the time I got through the leap, I feel a lot more comfortable about coming out as an awakened person, and feel like it's really a matter of trusting my own awakening process enough to be able to do that. It's a matter of trust for me. And it also feels like these times that we're living in are calling those of us who have been on a path of gradual awakening for a while to kind of own that more and to find new ways of more fully showing up in the world. Would you agree with that?
I think so, yeah. I think the world is in such a difficult situation at the moment, and there are so many negative trends taking place in the world at the moment. The awakened people, however intensely awakened they are, even if they've only just begun to follow the path of awakening, we all have a responsibility to not proclaim ourselves, but to come out and to spread, the message that we are, or spread the experiences that we're having. We need to make sure that wakefulness becomes more acceptable and more commonplace, because I think a lot of people have awakening experiences, but don't tend to tell other people about them. They're afraid that they'll be thought of as strange, or maybe they don't even understand them. So I think the more exposure wakefulness has, and the more common it becomes for people to talk about these experiences, then the easier it will be for other people to talk about them, and eventually it will become completely acceptable in our culture.
Yeah. And I think a big part of doing that is just through our presence. Like in my conversation with my dad and my uncle, it was really intense, and my ego was kind of scrambling. I didn't know what I was doing, but I just kept taking deep breaths. It was my brother who pointed it out to me later, and I just had this awareness that all I could do in that moment was be as present as possible and let my presence speak for itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. And often it becomes unconscious. Now, if you are an awakened person, you affect the people around you with a kind of radiance which you emit unconsciously. So you don't really have to say anything. You just need to be there, to be present, to give your full attention to somebody, and they will absorb some of your radiance even without realizing.
Yeah, I really felt that when I got the opportunity to meet Eckhart Tolle at our offices at New World. It's just like he felt like his presence was so strong that it felt like a tuning fork that I could kind of just like get in alignment with.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, people who are awakened are very attractive. It can even be interpreted as romantic attraction, sexual attraction, and sometimes, I think sometimes people become very attractive in a whole range of ways when they become awakened. So that's another temptation which spiritual teachers have to be careful with. There are many cases of spiritual teachers who misuse or exploit their followers, and I think there is certainly this charisma or radiance which awakened people emit, and they can definitely affect the people around them in quite a powerful way.
Yes. Yes. Thank goodness for that. And I've heard you say that spiritual development is more about getting out of our own way so source can come through us and allowing what is already within us to emerge versus trying to force or make anything happen. Could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah. When we follow a path of spiritual development, sometimes we can do it in a very kind of rigid and egoic way, particularly if we're following a kind of prescribed spiritual path. And if we become too rigid and egoic about it, we can actually block the transformational process. A bit like, writers suffer from writer's block when they become too aware of the process of writing and their inspiration becomes blocked. So our own awakening process can be blocked when we become too egoic and rigid about our own spiritual progress. So in a sense, we need to tread a careful balance between, getting out of the way, but also being open to a process which we kind of unconsciously direct. So when we become awakened, we definitely have the sense that something transcendent is flowing through us, whether it be life itself or a transcendent spiritual force. Some people might call it God if you come from a monotheistic background. But there's a definite sense that we're expressing something which is bigger than us. And in a sense that we're allowing life itself to live through us and to guide our actions. And I think you could even say that that's related to evolution. That spiritual awakening is a kind of a furtherance or a side product of the evolutionary process. And so when we follow a spiritual path and we try to expand our awareness, we're really allowing an evolutionary urge to flow through us, and an urge which is millions or billions of years old, and that's why it's so powerful.
Yes, and that reminds me a lot of Barbara Marx Hubbard's book that we published called Conscious Evolution, where she really goes into that.
Oh, right. Yeah, this, I don't know that book. I've heard of some of her work.
Yes, that was a book that we published of hers quite a while back. Yeah. And we just did an anniversary edition recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So what role does spiritual practice play in awakening?
Well, some people don't need spiritual practice if they are naturally awakened. And also, if you undergo a sudden and dramatic awakening, then again, you don't really need spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is a bit like it's the raft that takes you across the river. So obviously, when you arrive on the other shore, then you can let go of the raft. But for people I think a lot of people feel an impulse to awaken. They have a sense that they are asleep to some degree, and they feel an impulse to wake up. And they're drawn to spiritual practices in order to wake up. So spiritual practice can be a tool through which we gradually awaken. And meditation in particular, meditation is probably the single most important spiritual practice which can lead to gradual awakening.
Yes, I'm a big fan of meditation, and I think it helps me. I would do an equanimity meditation, and it really helps me see when I've slipped out, when I'm in my old self system, because I'll be like, the new self system is practicing equanimity, and then I'll like have a sudden outburst with my boyfriend and be like, oh, that was not very equanimous. But it's through that meditation practice that I can kind of see that.
Yeah, meditation takes us below the surface of our minds. So the surface of our minds are often quite discordant, full of sort of turbulent thought chatter and the stirring of emotions and fears and desires. And it's very easy for us to get trapped at the surface. And sometimes it just takes a few minutes of meditation to calm the turbulence on the surface and to allow yourself to go beneath into the stillness, which is always below the turbulence.
Yeah, it's like a barrier of fear, mind fear you have to get past.
Yeah, it's just like the ocean. The surface of the ocean is often turbulent, There's often the roar and the swelling and foaming of the waves. But just as soon as you go, 1 meter or 2 meters below the surface, suddenly you're in the midst of stillness, endless depths of stillness, stretching all the way down to the bottom of the ocean.
Yes. And you say that when we undergo awakening as individuals, we contribute to the awakening of the whole species. And how so?
That's connected to evolution, because evolution, right from the beginnings of life on Earth, evolution is a process through which living beings become more complex physically, so that more and more cells come together. The cells take on different functions. Slowly nervous systems form and brains become more and more complex, until you reach the human race where we have 100 billion cells in our brains. So we're the most physically complex life forms on the planet. But evolution also has an inner dimension, so that as living beings become more complex physically, they also become more inwardly alive. So their awareness expands. Their awareness of the world around them expands. Their awareness of their own inner world expands. So evolution is this process of increasing expansion of awareness. So, as I mentioned before, when we undergo spiritual development, we're really taking the evolutionary process further. So it is a kind of conscious evolution. So we're expanding our awareness in the same way that evolution has expanded the awareness of living beings throughout history. And the important thing to remember is that on one level, in the essence of our beings, human beings are closely interconnected. We all share the same essential consciousness. So that when I undergo spiritual development, or when I undergo a spiritual awakening, it affects the whole of the collective consciousness of the human race. So it builds up the momentum of the whole awakening process for a whole species. So every person's awakening brings the whole human race close to awakening.
Yes. And you also say in the book that as this awakening is happening, that perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that some of the opposing traits to awakening seem to be getting stronger. Because when a new phase begins, the characteristics of the previous ones will get stronger and more entrenched in response to the threat of demise. Will you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's a common phenomenon that when the values of a group or of a paradigm are threatened, then those values try to assert themselves more strongly. They become more rigid. They try to become more fixed. Just so that because they feel threatened and they're trying to maintain themselves. I compare it to, if you get like an immigrant community in a country, then often the immigrant community sort of clings to the values of their culture more and more strongly, because they know that these values are threatened by the wider culture they live in. So they make a really strong effort to maintain those values and to maintain the culture, the conventions of their culture. So in the same way, I think at the moment, the values of the sleep state, which are the values of materialism, self-seeking, values of domination of nature, the exploitation of natural resources, and so the sort of patriarchal male domination and similar, all these kind of patriarchal domineering values. These are the values of the sleep state. They're represented in a very extreme way by Donald Trump. So sorry to bring him back into the conversation, but so it's not surprising that these values are being threatened at the moment by a rising tide of awareness, a rising tide of consciousness, a rising tide of awakening. So these sleep values, these materialistic patriarchal values, they're trying to assert themselves more strongly in the world. So that's why I think there's an upsurge in nationalism, which is represented by Brexit and by Donald Trump and other nationalistic movements in the world. I think these values, these nationalistic patriarchal values, are being threatened, so they're trying to they're making a really big effort to maintain themselves, digging their heels in because they feel threatened.
Yes. And it just helps me so much to be able to put it in that context and just to see it as part of the bigger process, which is really what this book has done. It's such an overarching view of this process, and it really helped me find grounding in it. So I thank you for writing in it. I thank you for being here with me today. We are already out of time, so I'm going to have to say goodbye for now, but I'd love to have you come back on a future show to talk about this more.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. That'd be great. I'd love to come back. Thanks.
Wonderful. And for more information about Steve Taylor and the Leap, you can visit him online at stephenmtaylor.com. That's STEVENMTAYLOR.com. And as always, if you enjoyed today's podcast, your 5-star rating and our review in iTunes would be greatly appreciated. I'd also like to invite you to join the New World Now podcast community on Facebook, where you can be a part of discussions about current episodes and stay up to date on the latest and greatest podcast news. Simply search for New World Now podcast on Facebook to join the group, and I'll hope to see you there and look forward to connecting on future episodes of New World Now.
Thank you for listening to New World Now with Kim Corbin from New World Library. New World Library publishes books and audio that inspires and challenges us to improve the quality of our lives and our world. For more information about their books and authors, visit them online at newworldlibrary.com.